Hyperlexia is a super niche category, but it's one I've been wanting to cover for a long time. It's a very under-researched, misunderstood diagnosis, which hopefully today will shed some light on. Today is called Am I Hyperlexic? No one's going to walk away being diagnosed as being hyperlexic. One, it's only diagnosed in children. It kind of disappears as you get older sometimes, or the symptoms kind of they show up different, but I will explain that. So the title of today was a bit of a red herring. I'm Nat, and I'm the head of community at an organization called Exceptional Individuals. We're based in the UK, and we support neurodiverse individuals, people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, and anything else that kind of falls under that umbrella. We deliver these sessions just out of goodwill because we think as much as we work with corporates to help them become more inclusive, it's super important that we just spread the awareness, not just focusing on all the negatives, but also focusing on the strengths of having a differently wired mind. So hopefully that's a good enough intro, and we'll get going. So yeah, today is going to be focusing on hyperlexia, but there is a big overlap between autism and dyslexia, so you will be hearing about them. Hyperlexia is very rarely a solo condition. It's normally co-occurring with another diagnosis. But a little bit more about us. So we recruit diverse talent. If you're in the UK and you're neurodiverse and wanting to get a job, get in touch. So for instance, Philip, your son, if he would be interested, would be a great organization for him to get in contact with. Everything we offer to individuals is 100% free. We only charge organizations. We deliver workplace needs assessment, and that's essentially getting the support you need in the workplace. Workshops and guides like today, and drop-in sessions. No US. Okay, Jay, just quickly, we do work in the US, but there's certain things we can only do in the UK. So still worth getting in touch, but no, we're limited in where we're able to support. And what makes us particularly unique is that our team is 80% neurodiverse. So we got everything under the sun. I was diagnosed with autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, but to be totally honest with you, I think I may have had hyperlexia, but it just wasn't diagnosed or picked up. And that's kind of what got my interest in this subject, because so many people are diagnosed with autism when actually it's hyperlexia. But because most people, including practitioners and people who are qualified to diagnose, just do not have the awareness. And also, it's not an official diagnosis in a lot of countries. In the UK, it's still early days. In the US, it's recognized but very broadly defined. First of all, I always like to define what do I actually mean by neurodiversity. For those of you who do not know, the brain, is amazing. We have cognitive variation and diversity all over the shop. And for some reason, society claimed that one way of thinking was the only way. And anyone who fell outside of those parameters of a normal way of thinking was disabled. Now, amazingly, we've realized that's not true. And there's multiple ways to think differently. So this is why we came up with the term neurodiverse, because beforehand it was just disability. And I'm not saying, autism or dyslexia or dyspraxia can't be a disability. It absolutely can, but it's more of a societal disability, meaning that because we have not made reasonable adjustments or created systems in a certain way, that has disabled individuals. But if the world was kind of created a little bit different, it wouldn't be one. Now, if you see here, you can see some people, this is like an average. So these skills can be completely different depending on the individual. But some people can have amazing skills, let's say in maths, but might not be so creative, great decision makers. And it's that fluctuation of ability which defines being neurodiverse. If you're just bad at stuff, you're not neurodiverse. If you're just a genius, you're not neurodiverse. You've got to have those really high and low spikes. That will define whether or not you fall under the neurodiverse. And this is why it's quite difficult to classify what it is or what it isn't, because a lot of things can fall under this. But typically it was just used for autism originally, but it's definitely progressed and moved on since then. So am I hyperlexic? If you are wondering for yourself, answer the questions as we go along from your own perspective or as when you were younger, because typically the symptoms do not show as an adult. But if not, you can do it from your child's perspective. But just know I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of it is you who have it rather than as a child. So what is hyperlexia? Hyper just means better than, and lexia means reading or language. So you think of dyslexia, dys, not being able to do, not being able to read or write very well, hyper, above average. Now, the critical signs of hyperlexia. So these are the things which, if you do not have, you're probably not hyperlexic. Signs of a developmental disorder. So you have to have some area which has been slower to develop than the rest of the population, something which you find more challenging. Lower than normal understanding. So potentially you might read things, you might consume information, you're able to bring it into your head, but you might struggle to process it and get the right meaning. So it could be comprehension, context, anything along those lines. The next is ability to learn quickly. So we mentioned things which you could consider negatives, but the positives is you can be way above your peers. I think it's been proven that even like 18-month-old babies have been able to like learn to read extra fast, or you're ahead of your peers in terms of like certain types of problem solving. A lot of people, a lot of children with hyperlexia has been shown to be amazing at solving puzzles, like 1,000 pieces of puzzles. And there's even an instance of a child doing it all back to front, so only solving it with like the shapes. So really fascinating. Jade says, as in asynchronous development, emotional development, for example. Yes, emotional development is another key one. But as we will be going on a little bit, there's 3 different types of hyperlexia. And when we talk about hyperlexia, today we're predominantly going to be talking about number 3. The others will still relate, but you'll see why we'll talk about 3 mainly. And also there's the affinity for books. So, you know, they might like reading, they might like draw out letters in the air. It could be anything with like a love for words. There's even been research that have proven that children have been able to learn multiple languages, yet still not actually comprehend what the words mean. So imagine that, not just one language, but multiple languages at a young age, but lack the understanding of what the context is. So it's actually really fascinating. Sometimes it's called the Einstein syndrome, but that mainly refers to individuals who struggle with speech at a young age, but are essentially a genius. So here are the 3 types, and I promise you we'll get more interactive in a minute, but it's good to cover the basics. So Hyperlexia 1 consists of being bright, neurotypical children who simply read early. So if you just got a kid who is amazing at reading, doesn't seem to have any other different conditions or abnormal, you might say, ways of processing the world, hyperlexia 1. We don't really refer to hyperlexia as this one just because it's technically hyperlexia, but it's not what we think of when we're talking about it. Then there's hyperlexia 2, has autism and is fascinated with letters and numbers very early on. Obviously, I'm simplifying it, but these are the common characteristics that professionals all agree on. And I made a real clear note to say has autism, because as we'll clearly learn, autism and hyperlexia are not the same thing. I'll repeat that. Autism and hyperlexia are not the same things, but there is a massive relation between the both. This is why if you have autism, so those who struggle with socializing, verbal communication, processing the world, while still having abilities that far proceed their peers at an early age, this could be hyperlexia number 2. A common differentiator between hyperlexia 3 and autism is that those with autism may struggle with processing emotions around them, where hyperlexic 3 doesn't, or not necessarily. So number 3 is autism-like syndrome, with a fascination with letters and numbers. Now, the term autism-like is really important because when you ask yourself, how many people do you know who are diagnosed with hyperlexia? I'm going to imagine most of you don't know any. But how many people have autism-like characteristics? A lot. And this is because a lot of people misdiagnose it as autism. But that's quite damaging. And I'll tell you why it's damaging. Because take, for instance, you're incredibly bright, but you have a delay in speech or kind of communication at an early age, you'd be put in a special needs group. And if you're not being challenged, you kind of get like you get barred or capped quite early on, and your abilities get stampled on. Now, with hyperlexia, typically as you get older, you can outgrow or kind of like you kind of grow into your body, and some of the challenges diminish. Where autism, they're with you for life, though you can learn to get better at them. And I think that's really interesting because imagine this, you've got all the potential, your mind is still growing and it's developing, and yet you've been put in a class which doesn't challenge you, and unintentionally, what was there to support you can actually stifle your early years and your progression. So if you are able to get diagnosed early on, it makes a big difference because the school system is where it gets most of us. Typically, I think, what is it, 3 to 4 years old is when people typically get diagnosed. After that, it becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible. While doing research for this, I wasn't able to find any instances of adults being diagnosed. So, what isn't hyperlexia? This is also really important. This is probably the most misunderstood of all of them. Hyperlexia is not autism. People have to stop saying that. But 84% with hyperlexia are on the autistic spectrum. So though it's not autism, it's really likely to be autism. You know, you're more likely to be hyperlexic and autistic, but it's not necessary. So for instance, you could have hyperlexia and not have autism. And though that's rare, it's still possible. So it's something that you shouldn't rule out. Some people think that the term hyperlexia, it somehow diminishes the term autism, or kind of is like people kind of like in denial, when it isn't. It's about getting the correct diagnosis, which allows you to get the correct support in school or ever any other forms of education. As I mentioned earlier, with the wrong diagnosis, it can severely impact you in your early years. Next one is 6 to 14% with autism are estimated to have hyperlexia. So remember that. If you've got hyperlexia, very likely you have autism. If you have autism, not that likely you have hyperlexia. And again, hyperlexia is not dyslexia. Yes, they've both got lexia in the title, but they're not the same. In many ways, hyperlexia can be the opposite to dyslexia. But that's not quite. So you do not want to say, oh, it's the opposite. That's kind of way too simple. Dyslexia, that people with dyslexia usually might struggle with reading and writing, but when they are able to do it, they actually have really good verbal communication skills. So their comprehension as well. If they are able to read it, or their reading gets better the older they get and they understand it, that's dyslexia. Well, hyperlexia might be able to read early on, but they might not be able to understand it. So hopefully you can see how they're very similar, but also the complete opposites of each other. And that's quite interesting. Whether or not you can be hyperlexic and dyslexic, personally, I think you can, but there's no evidence that I could find that could back that up. So I just want to be clear on what the science says and what the science doesn't. Okay, I think this is the last boring slide, but again, these things are really important to get to know, to get to grips. Actually, I don't really think they're boring. I think they're quite interesting personally, and hopefully you do too. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. So what is the key differences? Well, hyperlexia is normally misunderstood into 3 categories. 1, a gifted child. There is such a thing as a genius. So a lot of the time, we like to say, oh, Bill Gates is autistic. He might be, but also he might just be a genius. There is such a thing. Some people are just really gifted. And they do not have to have a condition or spectrum or label to go along with it. The next one is on the autistic spectrum. So a lot of people who show signs of hyperlexia normally get classed as being autistic. We mentioned how that can be damaging, but the key difference is autism may require special attention to help them with communicating better. So yes, they show signs of promise early on, but the fact they've got those other challenges that kind of go hand in hand normally rules out hyperlexia, unless we're talking about type 2. And lastly, you actually might be diagnosed with hyperlexia. And people, they may decode or sound out words quickly, but not comprehend mostly of what they're reading. So again, someone might show a lot of promise early on in life, but then they don't really develop in the way that you would expect. And then eventually in older age, they typically level out. April says, I'm not sure if Bill Gates actually has autism or Asperger's. I think he only resonates with them. Yes, you're completely right. He hasn't been officially diagnosed. He has stated he resonates with it, but a lot of people like to class him under that. There is a danger in diagnosing people when you're not a professional, because it can, defining who your role models are or who people look up to, if not correct, I think can be damaging. Jade says Eminem. I didn't know Eminem might be. No, you're right. He is a really great candidate for that. Oh, I know that. I do love him. So yeah, those are the basics. So I've talked about the theory. Theory is great, but in practice, what does it actually look like? So I'm going to give you some real world examples. So on this is, when you were younger, did you have an advanced ability to read words far beyond your age range? We got the first one is, yep, I loved reading. Second one, yep, reason was easy. No, but I could read. And nope, always disliked reading. I know for myself, I was always disliked reading. I love reading now, but it took a long time to get to that stage. So as you would have guessed by now, one of the key characteristics of hyperlexia is a love for reading. So someone just picks up book, always fascinated by shapes and letters. That is a classic textbook example of a hyperlectic. Do you have difficulty in understanding verbal language? Yes or no, sometimes. So yes, you can hear the word, but you might not always comprehend it. So you might get confused in communications. Louise says, I love reading, but found it physically hard, both sounding words out, reading the letters, and once read it, understood it, and absorbing it. Diagnosed dyslexic, but also reading books like Lord of the Rings, age 7. That's a really great example, to be honest. And when it comes to understanding verbal language, this, again, very closely overlaps with autism, but know that you can have one without the other. Oh, Philip says, my son uses speech/text recognition. Same here. I live by it. All my emails are written out using my voice, just because I communicate. Maybe not today, I'm getting rather tongue-tied, but normally I can communicate far more proficiently than I can if I was to write. So difficulties in understanding verbal language. And this is typically at a young age. So remember, hyperlexic in adults just hasn't been studied. I do not want to say it's not a thing, but there's not much evidence for me to draw any real conclusions. Jade mentions, interesting, I'm very preferable an auditory processor. Yes, certain different ways can really work. So people with dyslexia, for instance, would have good verbal language. All right, this is going to be a bit of an interesting one, and I need you to just stick with me while I explain how this relates. So I want you all to spend a few minutes reading this. You're probably wondering, why is Nat trying to teach me about China? And this was just an example of some text I could find, completely random in terms of why I picked this subject. But now you've read it, and hopefully most of you have been able to read it, I've got some questions for you. I know, pop quiz. So China's one-child policy increases the country's wealth. Is this true, false, or possibly can't say? Okay, so the true answer is you cannot say. And that is another great example of how people with hyperlexia can absolutely read, but there may be instances where they just do not grasp the intent of the piece. Now, I'm not going to do it now, but if we actually went back to the writing and you reread it, you would realize that you can't really draw that conclusion from it. It might imply, but you can't conclude. So obviously this is an extreme example, but it's more to give you some empathy of what it can be like. So imagine like a child reading The Hungry Caterpillar, but just didn't understand that eating food made the caterpillar fat. I don't know, but that's like an example I can think of. Who doesn't love that book, eh? It's a great book. The passage suggests that two child families will dramatically increase as sibling-free adults reach childbearing age. Is this true, false, or can't say? It was false. You cannot make that assumption. China says you can't make that assumption. The main criticism of China's one-child policy is that it violates human rights. Is it true, false, or cannot say? Remember, not your opinion, but the passage's opinion. It cannot be said, but yeah, you can't make that conclusion from the policy. So what I wanted you to understand from this is that people can read. It's not saying with people with dyslexia, they may struggle with comprehension. So for instance, they might read a passage and physically they can read it, but they might really struggle in terms of drawing information out of it. And the same is true with hyperlexia, but hyperlexic people can find reading very easy from an early age, but it doesn't mean that they're able to get the context from it. How does a passage have an opinion? I don't know. Try not to read too much into it. It's more about giving you a sense of empathy towards how someone can be a very intelligent reader. Like that was a very it was written to quite a high standard, but it still doesn't mean that just because you can read it, you can understand it. Oh, interesting. Well, I'll look into that. If you think that one's not quite on the mark, I can always adjust that for next time. This question is, what size of group do you prefer socializing and interacting with? Do you prefer being just by yourself, another person, some close friends, or a crowd? And this is one where a lot of people make the parallel between autism, because autism, if you break down the word, means alone, people who like to be alone. And people with hyperlexia can like their own company, but not necessarily. So the key difference for hyperlexia free is that where autism might have trouble, connecting with other individuals, people with hyperlexia free, will hug, will chat, probably wouldn't have any challenges when it comes to relationships. That is not a necessary connection. So yeah, obviously you can be, but this is where the difference really starts to show. So yes, in terms of you might have really strong interests like autism, you might have a special gift in a certain area like autism, you may struggle with understanding and types of communication like autism, but the kind of being able to emotionally connect with someone, even if it might not be understanding it, is definitely possible. April says, I played bingo with two other people yesterday. It was great fun, but I felt like I knew one person for longer than the other. That's interesting. And it was very informative. Brilliant. Now, moving on, how would you rate your social skills? And for that, those with hyperlexia might be more personal. So, in average, comprehension might be slightly hit, but in terms of empathy and connections, should be average, if not above. So, communication might be a struggle. So, hyperlexia do struggle with communication in early years. Relationship management, they tend to be fine in, not a problem. Where on the autism side, that does tend to be a problem. Active listening is something which people with hyperlexia may struggle with. And the key word there is active. So, yes, they can listen, but in terms of being able to take the information, process it, and be able to give a response which actually relates to what the person spoke about, that might be a challenge. And empathy, they should have no difficulty with empathy, really. unless they have hyperlexia too. So hopefully this gives you an idea. And I wanted to compare it to yourself. So as you can see here, like the average person in this group, whoever they are, would not be hyperlexic or unlikely to be. But obviously this is an average because you can see everyone's scores are all over the place. Do any of you have any specific, yes, I didn't say Pacific Ocean this time, or unusual fears? This is something which is interesting that it's even like like it's related. And I guess it comes down to being able to process the world. So imagine you're able to read and you read books about ghouls and ghosts and witches and wizards. Most people would be able to understand that that's not real. But someone with hyperlexia, for instance, might have a very active imagination and they might be, I don't know if, I don't like the word gullible, but at least it kind of paints a picture. Someone who you have to continuously remind that that's not true. Yes, there's a book about a unicorn, but that doesn't mean the unicorn's real. And the unicorn's not going to stab you. So we've got small spaces, open outdoors, act getting in the shower, or like Psycho. Wasps, enclosed space, too much noise, bees, ghosts, heights, octopus, frogs. And yeah, and the thing about fears is they're most of the time they're irrational. You know, like if we're at an edge of a cliff, of course you're going to be scared because there's a real chance of dying. But if you're scared of a spider, that spider's not going to do anything to you, despite you knowing better. But again, apply that context to a child who has an ability to read really at a high level, but struggles with the ability to know the difference between fiction and fact. And this is, that can be quite dangerous at a young age if there's not like the right guidance. Do you have a favorite word or number? I hope you like my GIF. It was a Peter Griffin from Family Guy goes a bird, 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 bird is the word, and it's similar to autism. Remember, it's about language. So what it means isn't important. The fact that bird is the word doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have to mean anything. But the sound of it, the way it comes out, reading it, the way that the shapes and the letters are done, they find particularly fascinating. For me, I love the number 23. I've always had like an asphyxiation with it. And there's no real context or explanation for it, just the fact that I like it. And this is a really common thing with an understanding of hyperlexia. So we've got 6, 9, Maximus, plunge, golfer. I like those words. 24/7, 87. It sounds like we're playing bingo. 9, links 11, 26, portfolio. They're all monsters on the moon. Wow, okay, 9. Actually, onomatopoeia. Nice. Fabulous. I like these words a lot. So quite often with children, they will come up with a word and they'll repeat it again and again and again and again. And that's because the brain doesn't, where with like OCD or other things, a word can kind of get locked on the brain. With hyperlexia, it's more the fact that the brain is fascinated by it. They like the lettering, they like the sound, they get enjoyment from repeating it. And this is why the brain kind of get like locked on. Hip hop anonymous. I like these. Amazingly, I got less tongue tied on all these long words than I did on the simpler ones. But hey, that's dyslexia for you. When you hear a word or a phrase just spoken by another person, do you tend to repeat it or echo it? Very similar to the last question, but not just a word that you've created in your head, but a word that someone else has said. A word that you're very likely to, if someone says, oh, hi, I'm Jimbo, and you might be Jimbo, or if someone says, oh, onomatopoeia, and you're like, onomatopoeia, the word is interesting to you. So regardless of the context, you'll repeat it. And that's the thing, regardless of the context, it doesn't matter what the word is. It could be highly inappropriate, but if you like the sound of it, great. Philip said, Son is very challenged with other people, but has long-standing friendships with 2 or 3 online global via Discord. Perfect. And, we all have different ways of communicating, and technology has been a massive lifeline for people who communicate in alternative ways. I see nothing wrong with it. Some of my best mates I've met online, and it's becoming more and more normalized. So that's great. Do you have an intense need to keep routines, difficulty with transition, or ritual behavior? Obsessive and ritual behavior is characterized when your free time and conversations is dominated by a special interest or obsession. If this sounds familiar to you, it's because this is what people look for when it comes to Asperger's. It's just someone who's really interested in an area. I mean, but that interest might come at the sacrifice of your personal awareness. So we've got some mean things. Oh, Sanjana says, depending on the word and conversation, generally speak it if it's surprising or needs to be remembered. Yeah, that's a good way of remembering. The one that got me good in front of a large number of listeners. Nice. April, the scientific term for repeating words or phrases is echolalia, although a more simple term for it is parroting. Parroting's a good word. I like that. When people are speaking, do you find that you listen selectively? So, has your parents, when you were growing up, ever said, the words go in one ear, out the other word, or you only hear what you want to hear? Or actually, it's said to husbands quite a lot. And these are hopefully getting a little bit repetitive. And if they are getting repetitive, that's good, because the real purpose of today is to really cement in your head what is hyperlexia, but more for me, I would say, is what it isn't, because I think that's where the difference really lies in society with it. I hate these games with a passion, but again, it's useful for today's explanation. Look at these images. Right now, I want you all to look at them as hard as you can, and I want you to do whatever you can to remember them. What one is missing? I remember doing these in like Scouts when it was awful. So a slide, food, no idea, a slide. The correct answer was slide, so well done. Someone who is diagnosed with hyperlexia potentially could be quite good at this. If you like had bits of puzzle pieces on the floor and you moved one away, or if they had a bunch of toys out and they turned their back and you took a toy away, they would probably know which one went missing. And it's just the way that the brain processes information, it's able to really like notice those things. Another example is, say if you read a book but you missed out a word and that was the child's favorite book, they would probably know you missed it out or you did it a little bit different. Yes, photographic memory. Thanks, Jade. Sunjan, you can't do it. You and me both. I am so bad at those things. But do you do self-stimulatory behavior? So we all do exercise, hopefully, but do you do anything like flapping your arms, rocking, jumping? And this is very much related to autism, hyperlexia too. Think of it as a way like you got a lot of energy and you need to get it out somehow. Some of us might swear, some of us might hit a wall, but whatever you do, it's just a way of expressing that kind of like built up energy in you. And with hyperlexia and autism, it can be quite challenging to express yourself in a world, or you have different ways of showing your excitement, frustration, happiness, sadness, angriness. So it's just a different way of communicating with the world. The challenge comes is that the rest of the world might not have your dictionary. So what does flapping mean? What does jumping mean? What does clicking mean? It's individual to the person. It's like their own language. There isn't like a definitive language, as long as it's not numbers and music. Do you think in concrete and literal terms, difficulty with abstract concepts? This is, again, textbook example of hyperlexia. You may not get abstract concepts. So imagine you're talking about a god or a unicorn or your auntie who lives on the Isle of Wight. If someone can't see it, if it's abstract, if it's something which maybe your auntie on the Isle of Wight's a bad example, she is not abstract. But any sort of concept which you can't touch or feel might be something which you find really difficult to wrap your heads around. An example is maybe a child might struggle with the idea of Santa. Yeah, I like the presents, but I don't get it. I just don't get it. And that could be a really great example. Okay, I would argue here, and now it is always abstract. Well, that's getting rather deep. We live in a very diverse world with very unfortunate normal acceptance of the beauty and diversity. That's a very nice answer, but probably too deep for what I had planned today. And this one is, do you have difficulty answering what questions, such as what, where, who, and why? Fits in very nicely with comprehension. Yes, you might be able to read something, say something, repeat something, but when it comes to really pushing in on it, remember the questions we did about China? Yes, a lot of you could read it, but when it came to what happened, why did it happen, where did it happen, most of us didn't get it right. So these questions can be quite difficult. So if you're trying to communicate with someone who may have hyperlexia or yourself, try to avoid these types of words or think about how you can word a question slightly differently. April says, I used to take certain phrases literally when I was younger. Nowadays, I sometimes take instructions literally, such as cutting ums and ers out of videos. Yeah, but it's part of your charm. So this sounds like you, or it sounds like your child, or someone you know. Brilliant. But what can you actually do about it? So bad news, there isn't any specific test to diagnose it. It's not common enough for that to be a thing, or at least there isn't to what I was able to research. A pediatrician and or a family doctor will need other experts in order to diagnose it. So if you want to get a diagnosis, be prepared. It's not going to be easy. So who can I go to? Now, these are just some of the people. A child psychologist is a great starting point, a behavioral therapist, a speech therapist, a special education teacher, a social worker, an occupational therapist. Now, not one of these is able to diagnose it alone. And they do not have like a manual where they can say, all right, tick, tick, tick. It's something which is more about discussions and it's more about how it affects you over a period of time. So it would something you'd have to go for like multiple meetings and sessions in order to have it done. So Jade said, my boyfriend is very fixed on literal interpretation, so he has truly helped me speak clearly and avoid too many abstract poetics. Nice. Nothing wrong with being abstract. Philip says, very talented at computer program and understanding artificial intelligence. Yeah, that's a classic example, being like really hyper focused. Yes, you might miss the rest of the world around you, but what you focus on, you can go into far more detail. Think of it like a magnifying glass. It's not very good at seeing the rest of the world, but it's very good at seeing that thing it's focusing on better than anyone else can. Talking about my son, how old? 26. Nice. And by the way, you're a great dad for taking an interest. That's really nice to see. If you only remember a few things from today, these are the key takeaways. If you read well at a young age, a bit of a prodigy, a bit of a genius, it doesn't mean you're hyperlexic. So you can't just say genius, hyperlexic. Or if someone's autistic and you'd rather they wasn't, you can't just say, oh, they're hyperlexic because you like their name or it sounds cooler. Those things are related, but they do not go hand in hand. Hyperlexia is a real condition, but it's also an incredibly rare one. If diagnosed with hyperlexia, it doesn't mean you're autistic. Likelihood is you are, and it's definitely worth getting a diagnosis. But more often than not, you'll probably already be diagnosed with autism because, like I said, hyperlexia is a co-occurring condition, so it normally goes hand in hand with another diagnosis. And more often, you might have a unique way of learning and communicating. We love labels as a society, and I think labels are useful up until a point, but sometimes you could just be a smart child. You could just have a natural gift. You might just find some things harder than others. Not everything has to be a label. Sometimes things are easier for us, some things are difficult. And if you do not see a particular benefit in terms of getting a diagnosis, then I would ask yourself if it's really needed. With great power or great diagnosis comes great responsibilities. And for those who really need it, it can be a lifesaver. For those who do not really need it, it's added baggage that can unintentionally put like bars to stop you kind of like overcoming. And lastly, if any of you do want to get a diagnosis, go for it, research it, but just know it's incredibly difficult because the amount of people who will have the understanding and knowledge is far and few between. That being said, why is it important that you attend it today and go off and do your own research? Because just knowing the characteristics and the signs and what to look out for can help make sense of your life or your children's life. As an adult, it might not be relevant to you anymore, but if you experience these characteristics and symptoms at a young age, it might help you piece together your life. Because, like I mentioned, and is that a lot of people who are hyperlexic get unfairly diagnosed as Asperger's or autism, and that means they'll be treated in a certain way. A great example is that you can have symptoms of Alzheimer's if you're really stressed. Now, if you get treated the same way an Alzheimer's patient gets treated if you are stressed, then the results aren't going to work. It's a bad way. So remember the term autism-like. Autism-like means that how you demonstrate yourself is very similar. But if you apply the same techniques in terms of supporting someone with autism to someone with hyperlexia, do not expect that you're going to get the best results, because it's like it, but it's not it. Welcome to my proofreading work. Agree. Okay. Is it difficult to comprehend? Yes, yes, yes. Seems like I'm not hyperlectic, which is a relief. I don't need any more labels. Sanji, well done. I think it's important to understand these concepts, but I'm definitely not in the business for giving unnecessary labels. I've got enough of them myself. Easier to find a coaching for at least a second opinion and knowledgeable person to brainstorm with. Yep. Sometimes it's just knowing yourself. If you personally resonate with something, that's good enough. It's a personal decision. The vast majority of the people exceptional individuals work with are not diagnosed with any condition, but they personally resonate with dyslexia and dyspraxia. And if they benefit from the support, then it doesn't matter if a bit of paper says they are or not. It's more about what you do once you know, not about knowing for 100% certain. Easy, writing speech. That was really amazing. Brilliant. Does anyone have any questions? Jade said, when did you start hosting webinars, Nat? Well, the last couple of years, to be honest. And during the pandemic, they just started to grow more and more. And we have sessions coming up all the time. Have you written about it? No, and I wish I could, but I'm heavily dyslexic. So for me, this is the best way of getting information out. I love reading, I love learning, but my way of expressing that learning has to be verbal, just for my way of thinking. And if any of you are free, Thursday at 12, we're doing dyslexia in pop culture. This was incredibly fun to research. It's on Eventbrite at the moment to sign up. Just type dyslexia in pop culture. And I go into how dyslexia was represented across time in the media, in films, books, theatre, even wrestling, the positives and negatives, and really kind of knuckle down on why do we think of what we think of when the word dyslexia pops in our head. It wasn't you that came up with that concept or construct, it was the media. So hopefully you find that really interesting. Tell us a bit more about your help to employment. So yeah, Philip, great. If you're in employment, get in touch. We can help with getting different software and equipment for free, mentoring and coaching. It's completely free under the UK government. So it's called a workplace needs assessment, and the system is called Access to Work. The best thing I recommend is going on our website, exceptionalindividuals.com, and you'll find way more information there. Oh, Sanjay, love the presentation. Struggling to get to work. Thank you. Tell us a bit more. Collaborate. You're very fun to listen to. Collaborate with a writer. Thank you. Okay, thank you all. I really appreciate your feedback. And Jade, if you're in the US, you can't do a workplace needs assessment via the government who contribute to the costs, but you can absolutely do a private one. Obviously, you would have to pay, but you might want to ask yourself if it's good or not. Essentially, what you'd get is a detailed report saying how your brain works and what could benefit it, and solutions that can help, be it free or paid training or coaching. I think it's really useful. For myself, it's really allowed me to work to my strengths, knowing what software, equipment, and mentoring is out there that would benefit my particular type of mind. Well, we have covered a lot today. And if you want to get in contact, nice and simple, exceptionalindividuals.com, drop us an email. If you want to email me personally, it's just nat@accept.co.uk. All right, thanks all. I hope you have a great rest of your day and been really great having you here.